Thanks everybody for coming out on Sunday afternoon. So we can just get started right off the bat. I want to give a perspective on Hawaii's coral reefs from a global standpoint. My current job is Chief Scientist for National Geographic Pristine Seas Project, which is a 5-year project to try to conserve the last wild places on the planet. So I've been fortunate enough to visit some of the most amazing places that I'll share with you in a minute, and I'd like to put what's going on in Hawaii and elsewhere in that context. In addition to that, my other day job is running the Fisheries Ecology Lab at the University of Hawaii, so we have an active lab there, so a lot going on. So it's kind of hard not to jump in the water and be inspired by this. I started my career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tonga in the early 1980s, and my job was to work with commercial fishermen. It was the second best job I ever had in my life after this one. But it really inspired me to want to spend the rest of my life on and under the water, because these guys relied on the water, they understood the water, and it's kind of inspiring, and just wanted me to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out what was going on in the ocean. So that's been the impetus for my career ever since. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people on the planet, and our impacts are getting larger and exponentially larger by the day. You know, this is everything from fishing to pollution to ship traffic, you name it. And it's obvious where there's a lot of people: Southeast Asia, parts of coastal Africa, all of Europe, all of North America. The human footprint is huge, and there's very few places left that are kind of untouched. The Arctic, the Antarctic, scattered places around that I'll talk about in a minute. But our impact is huge, and we have to recognize that. We have to look at the places that are least impacted now, try to protect them, but also deal with the places where there are people, because that's where we derive the most benefit from the ocean and where we need to kind of redouble our efforts. Global footprint of fishing, equally dramatic. Southeast Asia, the fishing pressure is just truly amazing what goes on. These areas in the Gulf of Thailand get trawled on an average annual basis of dozens of times a year, you know, each individual place. And so footprint is huge there, all off continental Europe, Gulf of Alaska, the upwelling areas off Chile and Peru. So again, the footprint of fishing, which is probably has the largest impact of all the impacts that humans have on the ocean, fishing is probably the most pervasive at this point in time, although climate change is coming in a close second. So this is what's referred to as fishing down the food web. And what we do when we start fishing is we remove the largest animals from the populations first. So the things that are easy to remove: large groupers, sharks go very quickly, highly valuable commodity, tunas. And we move down the food chain. We get species that are less desirable, they're smaller, till in some places we just have plankton and jellyfish. Sorry, jellyfish person, but so we fundamentally change the structure of the entire ecosystem that we deal with, and we have to recognize that. This is what we typically see when we go on a coral reef or any marine ecosystem, and this is what we think about is the dynamics of the food web. So a few top predators, some carnivores, but really dominated by the lower feeding groups, the herbivores, surgeonfish, parrotfish, things that they're feeding on algae and things like that. So that's what we fundamentally think is how the ocean operates, because that's how the land operates. But in actuality, unfished reefs function much differently than what we expect. And because we don't really get the opportunity to see these places that much, we don't really know. So all of the ecology, all of our management, everything we think about of marine systems is based on that little regular pyramid there. But the inverted biomass pyramid, which we've written about both in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and other parts of the Pacific, is pretty much of a dominant theme. We see places where there's no fishing are dominated by large predators. And it's a bit counterintuitive. How can you have more predators than prey? Everything at the bottom is working a lot faster and dying much faster. And so a fish that may, like a Fish that may want to live like 20 years could live half that long and grow much faster in a predator-dominated system. So everything's working much more efficiently to support all that biomass at the top of the food chain. Okay, this is the fundamental problem that we face in society. It's not just in the ocean, it's on land, but the shifting baseline, where each subsequent generation has lower and lower expectations of what we expect from our natural environment. If you're born today, this is normal. If you're born 50 years ago, 75 years ago, you've got a much different perspective of what things were like. And so, you know, we may not be in an unfished situation. We may never get back to that situation, but we don't want to be here either. So we need to know where we are on this continuum so that we can manage more effectively for the future. Okay, we've done a kind of an abysmal job of protecting the oceans, whereas about 12% of the land is protected in take national parks and other types of conservation areas. The ocean's lagging much farther behind. We're creatures of the land, we're terrestrial creatures, so we don't think as much about the ocean. And until recently, we thought the ocean was limitless. We thought we couldn't affect the ocean. So we've done a very poor job of ocean conservation at this point, but we're getting better. And that's kind of the goal of our Pristine Seas project, is looking at the last wild places and trying to get protection for them. So these are all the expeditions we've done to date, and so I've been fortunate enough to go to some amazing places in the middle of nowhere and see what pristine reefs look like and how they function, and try to work. So the project is kind of a combination of science, exploration, media, and policy, and trying to get protection for these last wild places. And we've got another dozen places to go. So back in 2009, we went to Cocos Island off Costa Rica. It's about 500 miles off the coast. So Cocos is known for its aggregations of hammerhead sharks. It's an amazing place, but there's also all kinds of silver-tip sharks and whale sharks, these crazy aggregations of white-tip reef sharks that you see at night, leather grouper. So it's an amazing place, and it's been protected, but just the nearshore areas. And so during our expedition, we were able to do some submersible work and go to some of the seamounts to the south, and we see the aggregations of hammerheads, these massive schools of jacks and things like that. And we were able to work with the Costa Rica government and by 7 times increase the size of the current levels of protection to include some of the seamounts. So we're kind of focusing on the other places that have some limited protection and need more protection, or places that aren't even protected at all. So that was a really good success story. Likewise, we went to Rapa Nui in 2009, yes, or 11, I forgot which one. But so Rapa Nui has a long history of exploitation. There's a lot of debate about who caused what, where, when. Was it humans? Was it a combination of humans and rats? They forested. But regardless, it's a denuded island. They're actually revitalizing their culture at present. But marine resources are lagging quite severely around Easter Island. We worked with the Chilean Navy. It's nice to have a big boat, with the biggest dive boat I've ever worked off of, and big guns. So we went to an island called Sali Gomez, which is about 500 miles to the east of Easter Island. It's really just a rock. It's less than a kilometer in length. And so we did an expedition comparing that and Easter Island. It's quite amazing. And the first thing you notice when you got in the water at Sali Gomez was it's pretty far south. It was about 25 degrees south latitude. So, but coral reefs are amazing and just full of Galapagos sharks. So very impressive for a little area, and very different in contrast from Easter Island. And as a result, and also amazing amount of endemic species. This butterfly fish here, Tipi uri, is an endemic species. So similar to Hawaii, there's a lot of endemics in Easter Island, so highly valuable. Like I said, huge coral cover, especially for a low latitude or a high latitude location, and lots of predators. And Chilean government, so this is Rapa Nui there, and then Sali Gomez here, and they created the Mutumupirahiva Marine Park back in 2010. So that's been another really good success story. Likewise, a couple years ago, we went to Pitcairn. So if if Rapa Nui is there, there's Pitcairn. So Pitcairn's famous for mutiny on the Bounty, the mutineers, and took their about 12 Tahitian women and several Tahitian men with them in the late 1700s. And everybody was looking for them. So they went to this island here that they were told about that was mischarted. So that's why nobody found them for a while. So they burned their ship to the ground right there and to the waterline. They all killed each other within 10 years, except for one guy, about the 10 Tahitian women who were left, and all the prodigy that they had created. At one point, there was about 250 people on the island in the early 1900s. Currently, there's 55 people right now. So it's quite expensive for the British government to support them. But there's 3 other islands in the group that are uninhabited: Duce, Henderson, and Oino, and all pretty amazing places. So it's a crazy place, 55 people. They're all from 2 different stocks, so you can imagine what the genetic inbreeding going on there is. But, crazy rough coastline. Each individual rock has a name and some story associated with it. It's such a small little place that it's just a trippy place. There's the anchor from the HMS Bounty, and the Bible from the Bounty is actually in the church in Easter Island. In Pitcairn. So that's it. It's kind of a crazy place. So we went to Duce, which is the most eastern island in the group, and just phenomenal place. Live coral down to 150 feet, just absolutely gorgeous. Sharks everywhere, really, really pristine place. So other than Pitcairn itself, where there's a modest human impact from the 55 people living there, these other 3 islands are virtually untouched. And the British government has recently just declared that they're going to protect the entire EEZ, which is 750,000 square kilometers, which is going to be a great conservation area. Tons of groupers there. Roy actually belong there as opposed to Hawaii. That's an invasive species in Hawaii, the peacock grouper. Gabon was an interesting expedition. So the west coast of Africa, pretty heavily developed, but Gabon really has been in the forefront of terrestrial conservation. They have about 15% of their land set aside in national parks. And so we were working with the government to try to set aside some of the marine areas. That's famous for the body surfing hippos that they have there, and just elephants on the beach. It's really crazy. One of the last wild coasts that you see on the west coast of Africa. In fact, the TV show that came out is called Africa's Wild Coast, if you want to look it up. But there's a series of oil rigs there. Gabon has a very small human population, and they're fairly affluent and well off because of the oil revenue. So we work with the oil companies, and this is actually on one of the oil rigs. So there's huge biomass of fish on these oil rigs, and it's also a stepping stone. So that coast of Africa is heavily influenced by lots of the Congo River comes in just at the border between Congo and Gabon, and there's several other rivers, so very, very wet, and so the coast is soft sediment, not very well developed, but those oil rigs work like stepping stones, so a lot of Caribbean species end up showing up on the oil rigs, and so it really increases the biodiversity. So the oil companies want a security zone around their rigs, so it's good for them. And it's good for the government. So they've created these conservation zones that include the oil rigs. So it's not unprecedented. In California, some of the oil rigs are included in the Marine Life Protection Act that the state of California has created. So it's a bit of a making a deal with the devil, but it worked. In this case, it seems to have been pretty effective. They've set aside over 25% of their EEZ in marine protected areas as a result of that. Okay, so what can we see from all these expeditions we've done to date? The biomass of these places, and particularly the biomass of large predators, the red part of this bar here, is just enormous in these pristine no-take areas compared to most of the places that we see around the world. So Cocos, the Coral Sea portion of New Caledonia, Kingman Reef, which is 1,000 miles due south of here next to Palmyra, Southern Line Islands, Oino and Duce, which are part of the Pitcairn Island group. And so these asterisks represent places that we visited in the pristine. So you can see just the biomass in these places. And then you start to see all the other places, which actually represent the vast majority of all the reefs that we see around the world. And Hawaii fares a little better than some of these places, but you go to places like Guam and northern Seychelles and Jamaica, places in the Caribbean, and it's really abysmal what the reefs have turned into, and virtual absence of predators. So the systems are really out of balance.
Is it Galapagos on there?
No, we're going in December. But actually, Galapagos is a mixed bag. One of my students has been working on the endemic group there, bacalao, for a couple of years, and its spawning potential is about 0% right now. So they've really massively overfished it. So it's a bit of a misnomer that the Galapagos is. You think of the Galapagos Marine Reserve as this highly protected place, but it really isn't. Fishermen have burned down the National Park Office before. There's a lot of conflicts going on in Galapagos. They're trying to sort it out now. UNESCO threatened to take away their World Heritage status, so they're trying to clean house. Okay, so now that was kind of the big picture. So let's focus on what people really care about is reefs, where they're people, and what are the benefits that we all derive from reefs. In Hawaii, like elsewhere around the Pacific, coral reefs have really important, critical, cultural, historical significance. But even to this day, subsistence fishing, even around many areas in Hawaii, is still really important as a food source. Commerce, both non-consumptive in the forms of tourism, but also just for commercial fishing, still really important in Hawaii. And in recreation, everybody uses the ocean in Hawaii, whether it's for recreational fishing or people right out here. So we all value a healthy ocean. And then I threw in biodiversity because it's something we really need to think about as the world gets smaller and our human footprint gets larger. Is some of these places are just so special and unique that we really need to think about that from a global perspective as well. So what are the threats? Overfishing is a huge threat in Hawaii and elsewhere around the Pacific. It's probably the biggest threat to coral reefs at present. Destructive fishing practices also are a big problem. In Southeast Asia, dynamite fishing is still practiced, and that is a one-shot deal because once you've gotten the fish, you've destroyed the habitat, so you really never get these things to recover. So it's really devastating, destructive fishing practices. But we've got all kinds of other problems. Sedimentation is pervasive, and Waikiki used to be an estuary about 150 years ago, probably one of the most important ones on the island of Oahu. So that's gone forever. Right out here, over by Koko Marina was also another important estuary. So these are gone, and we have to, recognize that and acknowledge the fact that it's not just fishing, but we have to deal with the hand we're dealt at present. And then climate change. So I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's certainly an issue that's kind of pervasive, and it sits on top of all these other ones. But we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, it's climate change, so let's forget about it, because as I hope I'll show, if we take care of the system, we can mitigate a lot of these large climate change events, at least in the short term, while we're trying to figure out what to do. So how does fishing affect reefs? Like I showed before, I hope, these pristine reefs are just dominated by large predators and beautiful coral reefs. Once these things get removed from the system, we have these mid-level carnivores that sort of take over. Once they're removed, the system is dominated by these herbivorous fish like menini here, which are really good. They're the vacuum cleaners of the reef. They're cleaning up all the algae and everything like that. But once you've overfished the limu, that's when the wheels come off the system, because then the reefs just get covered in scuzzy limu, and nothing really functions very well at that point. The structural complexity that these reefs provide really harbors an incredible amount of biodiversity, but also a lot of productive fisheries. So once the system is kind of declined, it's really hard to reset it back in the other direction. So like I talked about, Hawaii has one of the most unique fish fauna on Earth, but it's not just fish. When you look at snails or algae or anything else, it's about the same. About a quarter of all the species of most of the taxa are found nowhere else on Earth. But some of these things are the most common things that you see on the reef. Things like Hinalea over here, the saddle rats, or even uli. These are things that are found nowhere else on Earth, yet some of the most common things we see on the reef in Hawaii. So when we start to look at their importance and their abundance, these things can be almost as much as 50% of all the animals that we see on the reef are endemic. So that's important, and there's also a global responsibility to protect these things. Okay, so endemism is important, and as you'll see, Hawaii and the Northwest Hawaiian Islands really stick out on the globe as far as places that have a large number of endemic species that are important. But you also notice these other places on the periphery of the ocean. So Lord Howe Island is a subtropical location off of Australia. Rapa Nui, this is Rapa Iti in southern French Polynesia, where we were at in last October, which is another amazing place where there's kind of these big macroalgae beds, but yet coral reefs because it's very far south. And so all these places on the periphery really are unique and harbor a huge biodiversity component that's necessary and worthy of protection. So some data finally. So this x-axis here represents basically the distribution of that species, and this is the frequency of occurrence. So let's say, so this is Kure Atoll up here. Most of the species and individuals that we find up in Kure are endemic species, so found only in Hawaii. The bar closest to the zero axis is things that have a very, very small distribution range, so things that are only found in Hawaii. As you go further south, this starts to flatten out a little bit, whereas species on the Big Island have more of a tropical association than they do in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. So endemics are important, but endemics are more important in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands than they are in the main Hawaiian Islands. And to put that in a little cleaner perspective, we can see the three northern islands, Kure, Midway, and Pearl and Hermes, endemics dominate up there. And then in the middle part of the Northwest Hawaiian Island chain, there's an equal number of endemics and non-endemics. And then when we get down to the main Hawaiian Island, even though we've got a lot of endemics relative to the Northwest, the endemics tend to be less abundant. Okay, Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument was declared in 2006. Actually, President Clinton created the Northwest Hawaiian Island Marine Ecosystem Reserve in 2000. But it's really been protected de facto for a long time just because of its remoteness. There's been a bottom fish fishery, there's a lobster fishery that actually collapsed in the early 1990s. But it's, for shallow water community, it's really been protected and close to pristine as we can get in Hawaii. And it's really obvious when you jump in the water in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, you're not in the top of the food chain. And there's lots of sharks, lots of alua, monk seals, and so it's, you know, you get a much different feel being in the water in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands than you do in the main Hawaiian Islands. So we did some work back in 2000, and we compared the fish assemblages in the Northwest to the main, and overall when we look at fish biomass here between the Northwest and the main, it's about 4 times higher in the Northwest, in the main Hawaiian Islands. So that's obviously an effective fishing. But what's even more impressive is apex predators, like I talked about before, account for over half of the biomass on the reef in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, where it's only 3% in the main Hawaiian. So these large predators have really been removed from those places in the main Hawaiian Islands. One of the few exceptions, probably the island of Ko'olave, which has been bombed since World War II for the last 50 years, and then turned over to the Ko'olave Island Resort Commission in 1991 or 2 or something like that. And I just came back from there 2 weeks ago, and there's actually sharks and alua in Ko'olave, so it's the closest thing you get to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands in the main Hawaiian Islands. It really shows the effects of fishing. Okay, so there's still a lot, or lack of recognition, I think, in Hawaii about overfishing of resources. We have an amazing data set that goes back to 1900 in Hawaii. That's pretty much unprecedented for coral reef fisheries. And it's pretty obvious what's going on. So each of these is associated to these species. So I use the scientific name here, but those are alua, oeo here, bonefish, oveo, the nenui here, kumu, which is an endemic species here, aholehole, moi, and then uu. So what you can see in all these cases is the total catch. So this is commercial landings data. Commercial landings have declined by over 90%. for all these species over time. So some people dispute that and say, well, you know, after World War II, the economy changed, it's become much more diversified, not as many people were fishing for a living, and that is all true. But when you plot catch rates, so this is catch per unit effort, so the amount of fish that you catch per trip should not change over time. And that's this dotted line here, and in all these cases, they do the same thing. They peak and then they crash. And things like U'u and Kumu here, they get these big spikes back in the 70s and 80s, and that's really when the advent of scuba fishing started to take place. And then they fish them down pretty hard, pretty fast. Okay, so this is some recent work that we kind of did. We compiled all the survey data that's been collected over the last 15 years or so in Hawaii. It's about 25,000 records. And we analyzed it using the traditional Hawaiian spatial management unit. So there's aopua'a, which are watersheds, essentially, and those were nested inside what's called moku. And the moku basically represented kind of geographic areas, and they were the spatial management unit for the marine system. So land systems were managed in the aopua'a or watershed, so water was regulated, food resources and things like that, but the marine environment was managed at a larger scale, at the moku scale. So these things would be consistent, like you see, there's a kona on every single one of these islands for the most part, and that just represents the leeward side. So they're leeward, they're windward, they're north exposed, they're south exposed, they're wet and dry. So there's 42 moku within the main Hawaiian Islands, and it really served as a really good management unit to look at this expansive data set. So, and this is what happens. So this is resource fish biomass, and these are all the moku of the main Hawaiian Islands. And what's really obvious is I compared that to the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. So none of them really compare except for, like I said, the island of Ko'olave and parts of Molokai, particularly the North Shore Molokai. So these places that harbor a lot of fish biomass are remote places within the main Hawaiian Islands, which is a good sign, which that just says we still have places even within the main Hawaiian Islands that still look really healthy. Places around West Maui, the Puna Coast, Big Island, Ni'i Howe, things like that. But then look at the ones all the way at the bottom, right? So those are all the moku on Oahu and the more populated areas around Maui. So it's pretty obvious what's going on. More people, less fish, right? So we look at human population density by moku. So this is the number of people per kilometer of shoreline. And there's a pretty strong relationship negative relationship between the amount of fish biomass and people. So more people, this is basically the moku that we're sitting in right now, has the lowest fish biomass, some of the lowest fish biomass in the state, whereas some of these other areas here are doing quite well. If it was pollution or habitat effects and things like that, then we would see the same correlation here for the non-resource species or the species that aren't targeted by fishing, and we don't see that. So there's no correlation here for things that people aren't really fishing. So for this analysis, you have to say that fishing is having the influence on it, not other. I mean, everything's affecting the quality of the ocean, but in this case, fishing is having the most pervasive effect. So, what are some of the solutions? Marine managed areas have been advocated, and it looks like we have a lot of them, but in actuality, we really don't. Because the no-take areas amount to less than 1% of all the area in the main Hawaiian Islands. Partial protection, a little less than 4%. These restricted access areas are like Pearl Harbor, Barking Sands, Pacific Missile Testing Range on Kauai, Kaneohe Marine Corps Base. They account for another 6.5%. But you can pretty much do anything you want in 90% of all the areas around the main Hawaiian Island. So even though it looks like we've got a lot of protected areas, we really don't. And the protected areas that we've looked at, like Hanauma Bay, like Pupukea on the North Shore, like a lot of the other marine life conservation districts around the Safe, have functioned very well. So biomass in these areas is 300% higher than we see in open areas around. Number of large fish, 250% higher, and so forth and so on. So protected areas have been shown to be highly effective, although it's a bit of a third rail in Hawaii as far as talking about it, because it's really kind of a very divisive topic to bring up. So what are other solutions? Other solutions are learning from the past. Traditional Hawaiian resource use was highly evolved. It relied on, recognizing natural rhythms and processes, and kind of harvesting in harmony with these processes, and not in opposition to them. So recognizing cues like lunar cycles, seasonal cycles, habitat, and learning this through not only intimacy but passed on from generation to generation. So there's this large wealth of knowledge that exists within the people within Hawaii that is being revitalized now and being slowly implemented again. But again, there's still a lot of difficulties. The Hanauma community on the North Shore of Kauai has been designated as the first community-based fisheries management area in the state, and it took them almost 10 years to do so, and it still hasn't been signed by the governor. So there's a lot of reluctance on people's part to cede authority. So there's a lot of concerns on a number of people. Some of it justified, and some of it is just fear of letting go, but fear of changing the status quo. But that said, so Hawaii was one of the last places in the Pacific to be colonized, and they brought this huge wealth of knowledge that they brought with them throughout the entire Pacific. So ingenious methods of fishing were devised by the Hawaiians. Everything from funnel nets, spear fishing, deep bottom fishing, even with traditional practices and traditional materials. Pukilau over here. So it was pretty amazing. What's even more amazing is most of the fisheries management tools we have today were developed 1,000 years ago by the Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. So things like local management, closed areas, closed seasons, not harvesting individuals before they get a chance to reproduce, limiting access, which is a big issue, recognizing natural rhythms, processes, and the cues. So these are things that were developed a long time ago and served people of Hawaii and people throughout Oceania very well. And local management was critical. So I talked about, so these are all the aopo'a within the island of Oahu, and then these are broken down into the moku on Oahu. The Konoiki was kind of the emissary of the li'i, or the land agents of the chiefs, and so they regulated very tightly how much water was used for taro production. They regulated the upland forest, because you regulate the forest, you regulate canoe production, you regulate who can use canoes and goes and fish. So it was a very, very structured and regulated system. And this is a map from the island of Oahu from the 1920s, and you'll see the moku here, but all these individual names are individual Konoiki rights that still existed into the 20s on the island of Oahu. So although a lot of this broke down in the middle 1800s or so with privatization of land, monetization of resources, and all the other things we know about that happened in Hawaii, there was still recognition that these areas were still important. Even in Pearl Harbor, still all these Konoiki rights still existed even into the 1920s. And Hawaiians recognized that things did a lot of their spawning, their movement, so forth and so on, timing with lunar cycles. So Hawaiian moon calendar is broken down into 3 different lunar phases, and these kapu, or closure periods, are timed with each of the basic moon phases. So a lot happens during the full moon and the new moon periods, and so these were times where resources were most sensitive to harvest. So they would put kapus or closures on some species, not all species, during these times to allow these things the opportunity to spawn. This is work from one of my students, Eva Schimmel, who's been working a lot with some communities on Kiholo out here in Honolulu. And this is for manini, which is a very important food fish in Honolulu Bay, but throughout Hawaii. And you can see the spawning cycle. So those are the female gonads here. These are the eggs, and then this is a stained histological sample showing the eggs just about ready. Their hydrated eggs are just about ready to spawn. And you can see during the new moon period and during the full moon period, the eggs are fully hydrated and ready to spawn. So manini are actually spawning every single month. but they're only doing it around the new and full moon. So if you were going to set a management strategy, at least at the local level, you'd say these wouldn't be the times when you want to target manini. So having this knowledge in the communities has become really, really valuable. And this is from Momomi on the north shore of the island of Molokai, and the community has been managing their resources there for a very long time, but more in a formalized manner since the mid-1990s. And one of the first communities to develop a spawning calendar. So for the major resource species here, they identified when the major spawning peaks were for the species. So you may not want to put a complete closure on those species at those times, but this might be the time where you want to reduce the amount of harvest levels for these particular species just to give them a chance to spawn in. And these calendars have really been a good educational tool, but just a guide for people to develop better pono or proper fishing practices. Moi is a really important species. This was reserved for the Ali'i in ancient Hawaii, and it's a sex changer. So these guys change from male to female. Like parrotfish and groupers, a lot of other species change from female to male, but these change in a different way. But Hawaiians recognized that, and they had names for all the different life cycles. So moili'i are the juveniles, monomoi are the males, the polymoi are the hermaphrodites, and moi is just the female. So the moili'i or the juveniles recruit in the fall months to sandy shoreline, so along beach habitats all along the islands. And then after about a year and a half, they'll turn into male. So this is male gonadal tissue. And then they'll change. And so you'll see the male tissue here, and then surrounded by the female reproductive tissue there. So actually, at that point, they're not functioning in any capacity at all, but they're changing over. But then you can see the females here are fully. And then, so they spawn during the summer months, during the waning moon period. So recognizing these cycles that go on for the species are really important to help to manage that species. These are some examples from moi from the island of Oahu, data from the 1960s. So we can see in the catch, very few juveniles, so very few moili'i, a modest amount of monomoi or males, and a fair number of females in the population. When we look at some data we collected in the late 1990s, we can see everything got shifted over to the left. So many more juveniles in the population. Went from about 6% of the catch to almost 40% of the catch. And males are much more common, and females really have become less abundant. But more importantly, they've all shifted in size and gotten smaller. And this is kind of a big deal because big fish, bigger fish, make a lot more eggs than smaller fish. And it's not linear, so it's actually exponential. So a fish that's twice as big as another fish doesn't make twice as many eggs. It probably makes 10 times as many eggs. So big fish are really important.
Can you speculate why that happened?
Overfishing. It's overfishing. So when you overfish something, animals compensate. So they'll reproduce at a smaller size and they'll change sex at a smaller size to be able to compensate for that. But traditional practices from moi were recognizing that large females were really important for the catch. So they would release large females and let them go. And also not disturbing these spawning habitats because they're only falling up to spawn in these rough areas called moi holes, which is kind of an area that you'd see here, just for a few months out of the year. And they're timing it with spawning. So, with the lunar cycles for their spawning activity. So they really like to not disturb those aggregations during those particular times. And moon calendars have become a really popular tool for a lot of communities around the state. This is up in Honolulu in Kauai, where I did my dissertation work and still do a lot of activity. But it's not really, it's not like Hawaiian Fishing News where you're looking at tides and so forth and so on, but it's really about proper practices. So, take small fish, don't take small fish till they get the chance to spawn. Take this medium-sized fish, but don't take the really big ones because they're important to the spawning population. So they're used as a guide or a tool. This is the gonad index for manini, showing when they peaked and things like that. So communities can collect these data. They use it as an educational tool, but it also is a guide for fishermen to know when and where to fish. And what we've seen is, looking at all these community-based areas around the state and no-take marine protected areas and partial areas and open areas, is Some of these community-based management areas are just as effective as no-take marine protected areas. So you may not want to have a community-based management area in Waikiki, but a no-take marine protected area may not be appropriate for Molokai or something like that. So it's really the right tool for the right location. So we've got a series of different tools for appropriate management strategies. But I guess the major point is community-based management can be an effective strategy if done wisely. No-take areas are highly effective. Partially protected areas are really no better off than open areas like the Waikiki Diamond Head rotational closure. It's open one year, it's closed the next year. Any benefit that's gained from that is lost almost immediately. If you're ever out there at the stroke of midnight when it opens up, everybody's lined up on the beach and they want to go out there because they haven't been able to fish for a year, and they fish as hard as they can. So it creates a bit of a derby mentality, whereas you haven't fished for a year, so now you want to fish really, really hard. So you lose any benefit that you've derived. The reason that that area was created because traditionally rotational closures were a strategy that Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders use. The difference is that the controlled effort, once the thing opens back up again, that doesn't occur in the Waikiki rotational closure, and that's why it's not effective. Okay, so wrapping it up here. So Hawaii's marine resources. So they've declined over time. When the Hawaiians, before the Hawaiians showed up, it looks like the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, lots of big sharks, lots of big jacks, this pristine ecosystem. Pre-Western contact, they harvested the reefs in a sustainable manner, but they certainly had an impact on the ecosystem. It wasn't pristine, but it was managed for sustainability. Post-annexation, that's when things became monetized, privatized. It really changed the character of the fisheries. People were fishing for commerce as opposed to just feeding themselves at that point. Then we see substantial changes in the amount of fish that we saw on the reef. And today it's substantially less than that. And it's not just fishing, but it's all the other things I talked about, land-based pollution, destruction of habitat, and things like that. So we're kind of at a critical junction here. If we do nothing, it's going to continue to decline. If we make some modest decisions, then we're only just going to stay status quo because the trajectory now is decline. So we're going to have to make some fundamental, changes if we want to have fish and healthy reefs into the future. Some work we just did is published in the journal Nature, and it shows the recovery potential for coral reef fishes around the world. And it takes a long time. So, it took a long time to get where we are today. So you can't expect a quick fix and things to change that quickly. Some of these areas that are remote, don't have a lot of people, have a fairly quick recovery potential. So this is the time that these reefs will take to recover if you didn't have any fishing going on. So some of these areas forget about, Guam's going to be 60 years, if ever. Some of these areas in the Caribbean are going to take a long time. Hawaii's kind of in the middle of the road here where, maybe 30 years to recovery. So we need to have realistic expectations about if we want to manage the resources, how long is it actually going to take for these resources to recover? And, it's not just fishing, right? There's all these uses, like all you have to do is look at here, right? And you'll see all the uses that are taking place right now. But there's cultural practitioners, there's tourism, aquaculture, there's Obama body surfing, you name it, somebody's doing it in the water in Hawaii. It's just, a smattering of all the activities that are taking place here. So we have to, take all these into consideration when we talk about moving forward as far as managing the resources, because all these different sectors have a voice. So hopefully I've shown that the current strategies really are not that effective, and the trajectory is not that promising. And then throw climate change on top of that, and we've yet to deal with that. But I guess what I didn't throw in there was these reefs that are healthy are going to be more resistant and more resilient to climate change. So you get a big warming event taking place where all the coral expel their little algae that live inside of them. The reef's going to bleach. If you don't have herbivores present, the algae is going to grow over the reef, and so the reef's going to decline. Crown-of-thorn starfish and other places around the world can have these huge outbreaks. If you have predators in place, these are natural outbreaks, then they'll control for that. So if you take care of your own backyard, we can mitigate some of the losses that are taking place with climate change while we figure out what to do. But we also need to balance this, the importance of biodiversity. Hawaii is a very unique place. There's no place like it on Earth, so we really need to consider that when we're thinking about this common heritage that we're providing for not only subsistence into the future, but also, biodiversity into the future. And we can learn a lot from past practices. Certainly that can be incorporated into contemporary management system, but you can't just take it wholesale. Each community is different, each location is different, so that all has to be balanced as well. It's got to be a more holistic spatial approach, getting away from centralized management, which we currently have, the more kind of devolving and diversifying management. So it takes place back at the local level because things are responding at the local level. My students been looking at spawning for Manini, the convict tank, and they spawn at different times, whether you're on the Big Island or whether you're on Kauai. So if you set a management strategy where it's like, these things are closed now, and yet they're spawning there in one place and they're not spawning there in the other place. So really getting back to a more kind of, finer resolution, because these animals and the whole ecosystem is operating at this finer scale resolution. So we really need to manage at the appropriate scale as well.
Any questions?
I have a question or a comment, or asking you to comment on it. It actually seems a little hopeful if these practices that you've advocated can be effective. So basically, are you saying that the health of the larger ocean will not impact negatively these protected or pristine areas, or even areas that are improving through protections, through things like acidification and all the kinds of various pollutants that are being put into the oceans along all the other coastlines, that there's hope that this can actually happen and the larger ocean is not polluted enough to impact these coastal areas?
The impacts will not be as great, and it buys us time, right? Because the still trajectories for CO2 and ocean acidification and all that is going to, it's going to ramp up in the next 50 years. By the end of the century, it's something we're going to have to deal with. But places where all the pieces of the puzzle are still there have a much better chance of functioning and rebounding from that. So the answer is halfway between. It's like they're not totally resistant to all these things, but they can be more resilient.
I have a question. In the graph that you showed, it has the apex predators, a gradient of them all the way down, and live in the middle, and Hawaii was one of those in the upper range. Mm-hmm. Did that include the northwestern Hawaiian Islands?
It did not.
It did
just
not.
A populated main Hawaiian Islands. So hopefully, it can be kind of dire, right? But there's still places within the main Hawaiian Islands that are remote, Ko'olave, places on Molokai, remote places that still look really good. And this kind of renaissance of community management, if the state, so these are bottom-up activities that are taking place, but bottom-up doesn't work unless you have top-down support. And the state's really been dragging their feet. They're very reluctant to cede any authority, give any support for these activities. They're very fearful of this. But that doesn't work everywhere, right? You only have intact communities in a few handfuls of places. So what do you do about the rest of it? So we just need to take a more kind of holistic approach and think about what we want out of it. I don't know. It's sort of like somebody said, well, if you had unlimited resources and a magic wand, what would you do? And I don't know if there's a really good answer for that. It's just sort of it's going to have to be adaptive. I don't think there's a really good rule book for this at present. So we need to just kind of not be afraid to try things and not be afraid to make mistakes, because where we're right now at is do no harm, but we're actually doing plenty of harm by not doing anything. So I think we're really reluctant to be proactive, and I think we need to be proactive, because if not, we're going to have to be reactive. It's much harder to fix things after they're broken than to conserve them before they break.
I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the current NOAA proposal to expand the humpback whale
Sanctuary.
and make Honolulu Bay one of the special natural areas. And of course, there's people up in arms, some commercial operators. But do you think the NOAA proposal was going far enough? Because Honolulu Bay is just so badly impacted.
I have a hard time with that one, on the record or off the record. It's in very bad shape, right? Every single stream in Honolulu Bay is channelized. There's huge problems with
There's
it.
one.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
And it's a 7-mile stretch, right? So,
Yeah. Invasive lemur, like, every twice a day when Hawaii Kauai flushes out, all that nasty stuff comes out in there. So I think the public education effort is great there, because I think the awareness that, that they derive from that is important. But I think you have to temper people's expectations. It's a 75-year proposition, right? Whatever. So, there's a lot of people who say they weren't involved in the process. It wasn't inclusive, very top-down government. I mean, NOAA did do a fair amount of public scoping. It's going to probably have to go back and, and they're going to have to do a lot more of it. People were really reluctant for change. I remember when the sanctuary was first thinking about getting going in 1991, and everybody was like, well, we don't need to really protect whales. They're already protected. So they already thought back then that was some insidious thing that was going to happen. And they do their best to do, to have this as an open process. People are just very resentful of government, particularly the federal government coming in, and perception is that they're being heavy-handed and so forth and so on. So they'll take knocks. It'll be a long process, but I think starting the dialogue is important. They probably don't have the right answer at this point as far as lines on maps and proper strategies and things like that. But my main thing is just that people really need to consider where Honolulu Bay is now and not expect too much to happen in the short term.